While Lucas was struggling to pull the elements of his story together, his team was desperately trying to get the pieces in place so that, when his vision was complete, work could begin. These demands were pretty high, having to develop a film that was nothing more than a few ideas in their boss's head. So even as Rick McCallum was touring the globe talking about Episode 1, he and his team were spending their time in between working on Episode 2. Especially important were the recce's that he and Gavin Bouquet had in order to inspect possible shooting locations, assuming that what Lucas had told them wound up being in the finished script, of course. Sites for Naboo, naturally, which would require a return to Italy for the courtship, and there was a return to Tatooine planned. This time they were considering returning to Tunisia, where the original Star Wars had been filmed decades earlier. To their delight and surprise, no one had come during that time to mess with their sets, so the Lars Moisture Farm made back in the 70s was still standing. It needed some work, sure, but maybe it was a sign that things were going to be okay. For the fans that had a sense of alienation by Episode 1, maybe this would, like for Anakin, be like going home again. If Tunisia was going back to the beginning, Australia was going to be a break from that. All the films had principal photography completed in England, but at this time, 20th Century Fox was working on creating a brand new studio in Sydney. And while it was still under construction when McCallum visited, he was convinced that they could hit the deadlines needed for Episode 2. Of course, there was another matter to contend with. Much as the bureaucrats in Star Wars needed to be dealt with by even the highest government officials, so too did even the biggest filmmakers have to contend with a force in their own discipline: unions. There were concerns that the blossoming Australian film industry wasn't going to have sufficient experienced people for a film as huge as Episode 2 would prove. But the unions were naturally opposed to bringing outsiders in to do their jobs. McCallum had to do some hard negotiating there, so he essentially said, "Look, we have all these complicated sets and such that we need to be able to rebuild exactly the same as before, and these other things where we need continuity between the films. So how about this? You let us bring in our people, and we'll train some of your people on Episode 2 so we can hire X number of them for when we come back and shoot Episode 3. The unions finally agreed, ensuring that they could go forward, which would help save money on this big-budget movie. Saving money everywhere he could was one of the most important jobs Rick McCallum had, because the Bass Ackwards way of producing Episode 2 was going to play hell with their logistics. They had to find a way to budget a film with no script, a rough set of sketches, and to top it all off, entirely new film technology. So if $1 million here or there could be saved, it could offset the expense of building a set that they didn't need, or half a day lost due to a malfunctioning camera. Budgeting Episode 2 called for less of an accountant than a fortune teller, but with the machine of Lucasfilm locked in place, there was no other choice but to try to pull it all together. Despite this, especially in the wake of criticism from Episode 1, McCallum tried to reassure fans by saying that Lucas was working incredibly hard on producing the perfect script, and what he was giving them, some information and characters, was all that they really needed. In private, and in later interviews, he lamented the frustration of having to work under these conditions. So Bouquet found himself working in Australia with only a rough idea of what Lucas had in mind, and every 6 weeks they'd take all the models they'd put together for sets, head back to Skywalker Ranch, and work with Lucas to see if they fit his vision for Episode 2. They often weren't, and many expensive trips were needed before they finally matched Lucas's vision. And still McCallum would set the fans' minds at ease with comparisons to Citizen Kane, which didn't have a completed script until days before production. But behind the scenes the crunch was impacting the process, so much so that pre-production had to be condensed, as noted by concept artist Ryan Church. Some of the things that are normally figured out during pre-production were actually being done during production, he said. It allowed George, while he was cutting and editing, to bounce off our artwork and ask for new stuff. It's kind of backwards, but a lot more fluid too. This is more typical of an animated feature than a typical live-action show. While McCallum had concern about the inexperience of his Australian crew, one advantage that did crop up was a familiarity with many of the newer techniques, which is how Lucas got a hold of a new toy for Episode 2. Lucas had never been a real fan of using cranes in his film, but McCallum knew that the Aussies had experience with a brand new tool called a technocrane. When they showed Lucas what he could do with it, he immediately saw the possibilities. And in fact, it was not only used on this and the next Star Wars film, but it's become so commonplace that it was ubiquitous on the set of Episode 7. But while this was new, Lucasfilm had something planned for Episode 2 even newer. The success of Episode 1 film tests convinced them to do Episode 2 with a digital camera, which, given his background, was very attractive to Lucas himself. Now, this might sound as simple as, well, just swap out the old camera and stick in the new one. And if the results are looking the same, then this is nothing more than a novelty, right? But actually, this was a very serious transformation in how the film was going to be made. This was a new and untested camera that they were going to be using. They were pioneering this new approach to movie making. And so the experimental at heart Lucas was in love with this whole situation. But that wasn't to say that Lucas was willing to have his next film look like an experimental film. He wanted Episode 2 to look even better than Episode 1 would. So when he went to Sony, he laid out very specific requirements that the camera had to meet, and made it clear that he wasn't going to settle for anything less than that. This was why the work on Episode 1 had been strictly exploratory. There simply wasn't time to get a sufficient number of cameras completed to conform to the standards that Lucas had set. But on top of all the criticism that Lucas was getting over The Phantom Menace, Lucas was now a target of ridicule from other filmmakers. The digital camera was all well and good, but they weren't as good, and would never be as good, as film was. The technical issues related to this were valid. Episode 2 would be less than 2K, while 35mm was more than 3K. So yes, there would be a drop in resolution that could be noticed, which would be relevant when the work was transferred to film rather than played on a digital projector. In that case, there wouldn't be any noticeable problems. The result was that those who are more familiar with film, such as filmmakers, critics, and aficionados, would notice an inferior look of the finished product. Even Steven Spielberg felt that this was enough of a detriment to resist shooting digitally at this time. But Lucas brushed these comments off. Unlike the criticism around Episode 1, these were exactly the kind of criticisms that he was at home with, because it was really about him bucking trends. He compared it to the film at the dawn of the 20th century. They were inventing the way to do this right now, and Lucas was leading the way on it. He couldn't have been more excited about the opportunity.
I also have even another whole aspect about it. You know, I've always believed in the magic of movies.
Yeah.
And to me, the magic of movies is connected to 35mm.
The quality of an image that's captured on a digital camera does not stand up against the same image that would be captured on a piece of motion picture film.
When you're shooting a film, it's like doing beautiful art, traditional art. Video today is still modern art, not even good modern art yet.
This change offered huge advantages for the production, assuming they could work as intended, of course. For one, the expensive and time-consuming process of scanning the film into the computers was now completely eliminated. Incorporating digital effects into the film was going to go much smoother now. And that was an advantage for a film that was going to have digital effects in every single frame of the film. It also ensured that not only would money be saved in processing the film, but money would be saved on expensive reshoots. Instead of waiting for dailies to discover a flaw that required going back and redoing things, they could immediately watch after each take exactly on the film that was being shot. Fixing a problem was setting things back seconds or minutes rather than hours or days. And we're not just talking about things like makeup or continuity, but stuff that is only visible by looking at the final work, like whether the shot is in focus or the exposure is correct. They also were capable of doing things that film cameras couldn't. The lenses needed for the digital cameras had to be far finer than those of a 35mm camera in order to be functional for these digital cameras. but with that came much greater depth of field. They discovered that sometimes it was actually too good. The same way that later creators would deliberately add lens flare to make things seem more real, the work on the set sometimes required them to deliberately fudge the focus because it looked unnatural to have two actors both be in focus when one was so much farther behind the other one. There was also less time lost to reloading the camera. With a digital camera, it was once a day at most that you had to do it, instead of the multiple times throughout the day when everything had to stop to deal with that one issue. And because of its very nature as a digital camera, stuff that you would worry about on a big budget film, like shaky picture, hair, dust, pops and clicks, were a non-issue now. Of course, this did come with concerns about the limitations of technology. Harlan Ellison famously defended his use of a typewriter over using a computer by saying, "My typewriter doesn't dump its memory. I don't lose a book." Likewise, there was concern about putting a $120 million film into the metaphorical hands of an experimental technology. So rather than relying solely on the built-in memory for the camera, cables were strung around to where there would be several simultaneous backups being made. If the recorder inside failed, the work would not be lost. This would also draw criticism from traditionalists who said that they were once again leashing the camera after decades of filmmaking had finally freed them. But this was strictly a precaution. Some second unit work was done without it because they just didn't want to bother with all that extra crap under the circumstances, and the inside recorder worked perfectly fine. The main concern was the weight. These cameras were monsters that looked more like the weapons that the fictional clones would be wielding rather than tools for filmmakers. Heading up the crew was their director of photography, David Tattersall, yet another veteran of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles and the DP on Episode 1. He was certainly up to the challenges presented by this new technology, but to help facilitate the process was the addition of ILM's own Fred Myers to the camera crew. Essentially, Myers' job was to take all these people who were experts in doing their job with traditional film cameras and help them transition to doing the same kind of thing using the new technology. Lucas felt, and Myers agreed, that rather than reinventing the wheel, they should stick with the existing film crew makeup, even going so far as to ask Panavision for accessories to make aspects of the camera work operate the same as they did traditionally, such as for the focus puller, so that they weren't stymied by the new system. "Let's ensure everyone knows how to do their jobs first," was Lucas and Myers' viewpoint, so that the learning that took place was the way that the technology could be used. In other words, don't make them learn how to do their jobs. Let them discover how they could do their jobs better.
On this show, we've got to plug 7 cables into the camera. An HD, a time code, a gen lock, 2 audios, and data.
You would think this new way of filmmaking would make ILM's job easier, but in reality, they were even more in need of change than the camera department. While this was skipping the expensive scan the film step that was first required for them to begin adding digital effects, the raw footage wasn't arriving in the same state as the scanned film. An entire new pipeline had to be invented to prepare the new HD footage so that it could have the digital effects added. It'll still save money in the long run. It was just an upfront expense. Much the same way that a bus pass costs more than a bus ride, but it pays for itself if you have a lot of bus riding to do. And for Lucas, this made Attack of the Clones a personal milestone. After all the pushing and research and trial and error, this was the movie that saw him make a picture the way he always felt it should. Shot with a computer, effects added by a computer, edited on a computer, and in many cases, shown to audiences with a computer. While others were scoffing his rejection of the art of film, he was too busy having the time of his life playing with the tools that finally had caught up to where his filmmaking imagination was. This was no doubt a contributing factor to his decision on the director himself. The original plan had been that he would do only the first, just like he had with the first trilogy, but he instead committed to doing episodes 2 and 3 personally. But Lucas needed more than the technology ready for him to shoot. He needed a cast. Christopher Lee was the man Lucas had in mind when he conceived of Dooku, so his addition was obvious once he agreed to the part. But while a cinematic veteran could be relied upon to fill his role with the charisma and gravitas needed, the real concern was whether they could find a suitable leading man. Anakin Skywalker was the central figure of the trilogy, and in Lucas's redefined image, the center of the entire Star Wars saga. Finding someone who could pull that off was a tremendous challenge, and rumors flew as to who it might be. Leonardo DiCaprio, still in high demand after the runaway success of Titanic, was a name that frequently came up in the media, and with good reason. He was approached in secret by Lucasfilm about the possibility of playing the character, but he turned it down. He felt that he wasn't ready for that kind of role at the time. Thus, everyone was surprised that, instead of a named celebrity like DiCaprio, Lucas instead went with an unknown Canadian actor named Hayden Christensen. Christensen was naturally excited at the opportunity that this presented, but admitted to a sense of trepidation once he got the script. He told the Denver Post, "I was definitely worried when I read the script for the first time. The dialogue was, well, I didn't know how I could make it convincing. Listen, I was thrilled to get the role. It was one of the greatest parts ever, and I just wanted to do the best I could do. I mean, who am I? Finally, I just said to myself, I am George's voice. This is his vision, and I'm here to fulfill it, and that's how we worked." Lucas deflected criticism by saying what everybody wanted to see was Darth Vader killing everybody and being Darth Vader. Yet despite Anakin slaughtering Tusken Raiders in a foreshadowing of the evil that he would become, Episode 2 was not embraced by those fans that seemed to fit Lucas's description. On the contrary, Anakin was seen as the weak link in the story. So much so that the criticism blew back on the actor. Much like when Jake Lloyd played the character, Lucas was more interested in the technical aspects rather than the emotional foundation of the character, making Episode 2 more of a learning experience for Christensen, allowing him to then build upon it for the film's final installment.
If you are suffering as much as I am, please tell me.
I can't. We can't. It's just not possible.
Anything is possible, Padme. Listen to me.
Concerns about the film seemed to only intensify when Lucas revealed the name, Attack of the Clones. Given the B-movie sound of it, remember that Star Wars was not based on B-movies but on serials, which would more likely have phrased the title, The Clones Attack. Some were starting to take this as a sign that this film would be more embarrassing than Episode 1 had been. This wasn't helped by Ewan McGregor, on camera at the Hollywood Film Festival, when he was told by journalists what the title was. The way it was phrased, he thought they were asking if he had seen some terrible movie called Attack of the Clones. So he said, "I haven't seen it." And then they said, "No, that's the title. What do you think of it?" And reacting from his gut, he said, "That's it? That's a terrible, terrible title." He softened it somewhat later, saying it might be the right thing for the movie, but said, "Star Wars 2 is looking really, really good. The title's not a good title, but there we are." Work on it was indeed going smoothly. Lucas had an approach to the editing of the film where pickup shooting was scheduled in multiple stages so that the cut could evolve into his vision of Star Wars. This helped to flesh out the relationship with Obi-Wan and Anakin a bit more. Lucas realized watching the emerging cut, while Anakin was supposed to be rebellious and arrogant, and Obi-Wan a bit resentful of the young pupil, it had gone so far that it made him and Obi-Wan seem like they were antagonistic. So he filmed some pickup scenes to add some warmth to it, make the friendship that old Ben would tell Luke about more apparent. It was also during this that he noticed another problem, that there was a dearth of activity to keep the audience excited late in the film, and Lucas was sure that some action was needed to keep the film from dragging. At the same time, Spielberg was at ILM working on effects work for his science fiction film, Minority Report. So for anyone who read the episode 2 script and noticed the absence of one of the film's most well-known sequences, famous or infamous is up to interpretation, well, now you know. Of course, while this also provided the action that Lucas felt was missing, the scene also served to help propel forward the romance plot. In the sequence, Padme was now in a situation of certain death that was only averted because of timely intervention by R2-D2, thus forcing her to come face to face with her own mortality for the first time since she had realized how she felt about Anakin, thus making her confession of her love for him at the next opportunity a more natural piece of character evolution, and combined with the attempted execution at the end of the film to convince her to marry Anakin by nearly learning the hard way that life is too short not to follow your heart. The dialogue may still have been less impressive, but the whirlwind courtship now felt less like a hurricane and more like a Great Plains dust-up. Besides Anakin, unseen characters would have to finally have a face placed to the name. Those of Bail Organa, the father of Princess Leia in the original film, and Boba Fett, or rather the template for his clone, Jango. Perhaps in response to the outcry about Episode 1, which was accused of having numerous racist elements, these and other fresh faces would be played by minorities, with Bail played by television veteran Jimmy Smits. Smits was actually arrested during the time they were working on Episode 2, although not related to filming. Smits is a native of the territory of Puerto Rico, and he was protesting the continued naval bombardment of one of their islands. And so he, along with a number of other celebrities who were protesting, were all rounded up and arrested. Not to worry, it didn't get in the way of shooting. Jango Fett was played by Temuera Morrison, a Maori of New Zealand, and naturally also played all of his clones. This led to a case of you just can't win, as Lucas was lambasted over this casting for being anti-Latino. Not because Morrison was cast over a Latino actor, you understand, but because he looked Latino. So with him as the face of all of these clones in a film called Attack of the Clones, it was therefore interpreted as implying that Latinos were invading America.
I see.
They are totally obedient, taking any order without question.
Also, Jay Lagaya, who is Samoan, was cast to play Captain Typho, who replaced Captain Panaka from the first film because Hugh Quarshie turned it down. In an interview, he said it was because Lucasfilm didn't want to pay him enough, but his IMDb page asserts that he was unhappy that he wasn't to be given a complete script. But whether it was one, the other, or both, clearly he felt that he was undervalued and parted ways with the franchise. Though he did go on to do the god-awful 2-part Doctor Who episode, The Daleks Take Manhattan, so clearly he did not avoid Episode 2 because his standards were too high. Audiences were also surprised to discover a special treat near the end of the film. In The Empire Strikes Back, one of the earlier drafts had Master Yoda prove his Jedi abilities by combating a monster. But in the end, he was presented as more of a guru than a warrior. But it had always been intended that Yoda was a great fighter, and Lucas really wanted the audience to be able to see that. Ultimately, though, he was limited by the fact that this was a puppet. A digital Yoda could be more articulate, but he wasn't sure if they could do that. The animation team assured him that they could, so he said, all right, I'm going to write the character assuming that he can move like any normal actor, but I'm going to need some real convincing here. It was a challenge that the team was anxious to tackle. Animation director Rob Coleman said he wanted to be on Episode 2 just for the challenge of that, because not only was this creating a convincing living character, but it had to seem like a living, convincing character that moved like a puppet. The original Yoda's puppet limitations were nevertheless an innate part of the character, so his movement and expressions had to be that way, had to seem like the puppet team was all there, except they were invisible. Jar Jar had been, from a technical standpoint if nothing else, an achievement. But Yoda had to be the next step in digital character evolution if he was to succeed. Jar Jar and Yoda actually intersected in Episode 2, because with no Yoda puppet, Ahmed Best was asked to provide a stand-in for the character for the other actors to work off of. He was there anyway because Jar Jar had a small role in the film, now representative of his people on Coruscant. The original intent for Jar Jar was that the 10 years had allowed him to sound more sophisticated in this film. A facade, though, that would occasionally crack when he was excited. Essentially, Jar Jar would say things like, "Annie! Mooey, mooey, I am so glad..." I am so elated at this reunion with my old companion. In the end, Lucas thought it might be too confusing without an explanation, and the last thing the film needed was more time devoted to a character that people had voiced such hatred for, so they just went back to the old way of speaking. After 5 months, Lucas was shown an edited version of Empire Strikes Back with Yoda's scenes redone digitally, and he was convinced. So this meant that Lucas could now give the audience a chance to see the tiny Jedi Master in action, going toe-to-toe with Dooku after he'd already beaten 2 Jedi single-handedly, and in the end, forcing the Sith to flee. While some objected to this portrayal, the dueling Yoda was such a hit that it became more central to the post-release marketing for Episode 2.
This holiday, Buddha Man, Yoda Man. When you can bring home the ultimate Jedi Master in the biggest lightsaber-wielding adventure ever. Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Plus, this DVD is jammed with over 6 hours of even more fun and excitement you can watch again and again. Star Wars Episode 2, Yoda the Man. Available on DVD and VHS. Rated PG.
And it was needed. For while Episode 2 was slightly better received by critics, both film critics and the Star Wars fandom, the film would have the lowest box office returns of the prequels. It still made over $600 million worldwide, so it was hardly a failure, but compared to the juggernaut that Episode 1 had been, Episode 2 had diminished substantially. The mystique around George Lucas seemed to have dissolved. Before, he had been the reclusive genius, but now he was that guy who loved special effects and wrote bad romance. Even Roger Ebert, longtime defender of the Star Wars series, gave this film a so-so review. As someone who admired the freshness and energy of the earlier films, I was amazed at the end of Episode 2 to realize that I had not heard one line of quotable, memorable dialogue, and the images, however magnificently conceived, did not have the impact they deserved. And like others, Ebert complained about the effect of transferring digital movies back to film stock for viewing. The word was in on Lucas's great experiment. The digital camera was a flop. But for Lucas, this was just the first step in advancing a new technology, and he believed in it. As far as he was concerned, the first run was a success. Now let's make it better. From the beginning, Lucas wasn't going to be told how to make his movies, and with the film that he'd been waiting decades to make now finally approaching, he was going to do the final one on his terms. But there was one snag. The Episode 1 decision came back to haunt him. After having done 2 films now without enough material, Lucas realized there was far, far too much material left to be fitted into Episode 3. There was so much that needed to happen, and so many dangling plot threads, and so many things that he wanted to do. It wasn't a case of figuring out what he should do, it was figuring out what he had to leave out. After half a year of work on Episode 3, Rick McCallum was having deja vu all over again when there still was no script ready. When he was working with Lucas on a few production design ideas, a blank page was accidentally inserted into the material they were looking at, and McCallum commented, "Oh, someone has leaked the script." It was a gentle nudge for Lucas that he could really use more than just some remarks on what would probably be in the film. A week later, at another meeting, Lucas casually remarks, "I'm going to have to start writing when reality hits." "You said you've been writing," McCallum protested. "I've been thinking about it," is all Lucas had to say. And Lucas's remark, "Making a movie where the bad guys win and everyone dies is not destined to be the most successful movie of all time," seemed to foreshadow that this enterprise might just be doomed.